It's really a pleasure to be here, to be part of this event, and thanks to you guys for showing up. I know we're coming to the end of the conference here. Some people might be suffering from conference fatigue. Other people have flights to catch, so thanks for sticking around. I think this quite possibly is the biggest stage I've ever presented on, so it's kind of cool. I have room to move around, and because of that, I'm quite happy that I dressed up a little bit. I have a knack for showing up to these events terribly underdressed in jeans, a t-shirt, and sometimes a backwards cap. I've shown up that way at a few analytics conferences, and everybody's, those are the real nerds. They're in suits and ties, and I'm kind of embarrassed. And my friends just tell me to play the part of the rich millionaire who doesn't really give a crap and wears whatever he wants. Unfortunately, the bank account doesn't support that. Just to level set up front, I'm not the strength coach with the team. So I don't write programs, I don't train guys in the gym. So if you were coming to this talk to hear about strength and conditioning, I apologize. I do have a background in physiology and strength and conditioning, so if you want to talk about that stuff, I'd be more than happy to, outside in the hallway or something like that, but that's not what this talk is about. My role with the team is an analytics-based role. So I spend a lot of time working on analytics research projects across multiple different departments for multiple different things. But what occupies a majority of my time during the in-season is, did it change? Oh, sports science and player monitoring. And so that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. And I'll go ahead and put that up. This is kind of a quote that I really like. It hangs on the wall behind my desk. I think it's something that's really, really important for a sports science or analytics department to understand. And so it'll serve as a little bit of a theme throughout this presentation. It's from a statistician named Edwards Deming. Without data, you're just another person with an opinion. Certainly anyone who's ever worked in a team setting, whether it's a professional organization, college, university, even a high school organization, you know that there's lots of people in the room with lots of opinions on how things should be done. Coaches have opinions, managers, athletic directors, scouts, recruiters. And if you watch the news, parents gone wild and they're beating up the coaches for not playing their kid, you know that parents also have opinions as well as players. But I feel that in an analytics role, in an analytics department, it's really important for us to go the route of collecting data, creating objective information, and helping people make decisions. The quote I always use is, nobody's paying us for our opinion, they're paying us to present them with objective information so that they can action on. So that being said, these are the objectives for the talk. When I was asked to speak, I went back and forth in an email exchange with some of the folks at the NSCA. First, just kind of saying, I don't know if my topic is going to be something that would interest the strength coaches, knowing that this is a strength conditioning conference, so I was a bit careful with, is this something that people want to hear about? And they were very encouraging, of course, and that was nice. And so from that, I came up with these 3 objectives that I'd like to try and cover. First, give a bit of an overview of the sports science framework within the team sports setting, as far as I see it, my kind of ideas on that. Then we'll discuss some tools for monitoring, and we'll talk about technology. We'll talk about no technology, which I think is also important. We'll go through some of that stuff, and I'll show you examples and things that we've done. And then we'll talk about some basic analysis concepts. And I can certainly appreciate that most people in the room might not have the love of analytics and statistics and applied mathematics that I have, so if I did an hour-long talk on that, everybody would be falling asleep. So I'm going to keep that part very high level and basic, just to give you some ideas of how I think about approaching a large data set when I sit down with it, because that can be very overwhelming for people. And so this might give you some ideas if you're looking to get into this field for some of the students, or for individuals who are looking to hire someone at their team or university, maybe some of the skill sets or things that you would think about asking this person to do in their analytics role, particularly around sports science and player monitoring. So that being said, we'll go into a little bit of the sports science framework, and I think it's important to start by talking about what sports science is not, because that's kind of a polarizing phrase. Some people say we don't need this stuff, other people say it's great, we should have it. And I think a lot of it comes from a misunderstanding of what it is. The first thing I would say is sports science is not the answer to your injury problems. If you're a coach or athletic director and you're thinking about dropping a sports science department, and this happens, drop a sports science department into your organization and think all of the injuries are going to go away, they're probably not, because the quote I always use is, you can't expect change if you yourself do not want to change. So what that means is, if we're going to provide information, if we're going to report the weather to the people in charge, to the decision makers, they have to be open to hearing that information. The strength coaches, medical staff, coaches, they have to be open to listening to that information and having dialogue on how we can potentially use it and operationalize it. Contrary to popular belief, sports science is not about technologies. I think right now the media loves to popularize technologies, and it seems like every day there's an article coming out that says something about so-and-so team and their super secret approach to sports science and blah, blah, blah. I'll tell you firsthand, there are no real secrets. Doing GPS, tracking sleep, and giving people a protein shake when they walk out of the room, out of the gym, that's not really secret. The secret is probably in how you use the information and how you action on it. Because those media things come out, it turns into sort of this keeping up with the Smiths type of approach where coaches or managers or athletic directors are so worried or focused on the technology that they end up prioritizing that technology versus prioritizing getting the person in who's supposed to tell you what that technology means and if it's even useful at all. So they buy the technology because they think that's what's important. They drop it in the lap of an assistant strength coach or an assistant athletic trainer, and they say, here you go ahead and solve the problem, use the data. The problem is that these individuals probably don't have a skill set or a background in analytics. It might be a little challenging for them to get started in this stuff, and additionally, they probably don't have time. If you've ever worked as a strength coach or an athletic trainer, medical person in a team setting, you know that your day is pretty jam-packed. And so the program, the approach ends up falling on its face or not seeing the type of ascent that it can really have. The quote that I always use is technology and analysis don't solve problems, people solve problems. Get the right people in the door to have the right conversations so that change can happen. Additionally, be skeptical of black boxes. There's tons of technologies out there that will make promises to do every possible thing under the sun, and all you have to do is put your data in, it gets analyzed by a black box, and some sort of output gets spit out. I have a really hard time with this kind of stuff because if I don't understand what goes on inside the black box, if I don't understand the data generating processes, it makes it difficult to understand the output. And if it's difficult to understand the output, it's difficult for me to sell it to a coach. So be skeptical of black boxes. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And finally, sports science is not about charts and graphs. I know a lot of these technologies try and make it easy because a lot of times the technology is prioritized. They drop it in the lap of someone else in the organization as something else they can do. These technologies then produce some simple charts, graphs, and stock analysis. The problem with that kind of stuff is that's not sports science. That's using stock charts and graphs to tell a story, but those might have no context for your athletes with your team that year under those coaches, et cetera. You have to take the data out and try and understand it. So that being said, what is sports science? This is my definition. Sports science is the utilization of current scientific evidence and collected data to help key stakeholders make informed decisions about the health and well-being of the athlete. So quite simple, the athletes are going to go out, they're going to generate data, we're going to collect that data, and then we're going to use scientific evidence to help make sense of that. And this scientific evidence can come from multiple different areas of or topics, so physiology, biochemistry, biology, biomechanics, as well as statistical analysis, applied mathematics, business intelligence, etc. So that being said, what does a sports scientist do? Conduct scientific investigation of athlete-generated data, obviously. Set up best practice methods for data collection. I can't tell you how important this is. I go to visit teams, and sometimes what I see is data collected one way on Monday at a certain time of day, and then I go in on Tuesday, and it's collected in a totally different way. When you don't standardize the data collection, you end up with really noisy data. Really noisy data drives people like me crazy because it makes it really hard to understand what's actually meaningful and what's important. So one of the key roles of the sports scientist is to appraise the situation, understand the context and culture of the environment, and put in place some sort of standardized approach to collecting this data. And sometimes, unfortunately, you might have things that you think are really, really important to obtain on your athletes in order to say something meaningful, but you can't collect it because you can't standardize the method of collection. Obviously, contextualize and analyze data, and then finally, one of the other key roles that I think a sports scientist should have is appraise sports technologies to determine their use, if they're even useful at all. So things like reliability, validity, signal to noise. Within our team, I do a lot of in-house validity and reliability studies. This helps me understand what the data is telling us. It helps me understand what the technology's value might be, or tool, so a questionnaire or something like that. It doesn't have to be technology. This allows for two things. One, it allows us, if we're going to adopt this within the things that we collect. It allows us to understand what's meaningful and what's substantial and important within that data set, but also these kinds of things allow me to give a cost-benefit analysis to the decision makers who are going to be paying for it. So we can maybe pump the brakes on certain things, spend our money in more appropriate ways. This is the framework that I think is probably most appropriate, at least in my mind. Maybe others disagree, and we can certainly discuss that. But this is probably the framework that I think is most appropriate in my mind for a sports science or analytics staff. You have up top your 4 key decision makers or key departments that are all responsible for different things within the sporting environment. Then the sports science staff and analytics staff underpin those, and they do what would be called in the business world information services. So we contextualize data and provide information to those individuals based on the things that are important to them, based on their daily tasks. So contextualization of the data is really key here. A lot of times we collect data that might be useful for all 4 of these departments. It might be the same data set, but how we explain it and contextualize it may tell a different meaningful story for each of those departments. Obviously, one of the key roles for the sports science staff within a team setting is monitoring. So a little bit of the rationale for monitoring, really, really easy. Understand training and performance. Not all athletes respond the same way. Everybody knows this. If you took 20 athletes and you gave them all the exact same training program, you'd probably have the average of the group improve at a certain rate. You know, you'd have a few off to the right who are going to blow it out of the water and really improve. You'll have a few off to the left who maybe have no improvement, and then maybe a few others off to the far left who have a negative or maladaptive response. So monitoring allows us to answer the question, are we really getting what we want from the training program, and hopefully make adjustments. You know, I go out, I visit teams sometimes, and sometimes technology can help us objectify what's going on the field, either in game day or in practice, but a lot of times then you walk in the weight room and maybe they don't record anything on the players. They don't have any idea of training loads and intensities and things like that. And for me, it's really hard to wrap my head around how you're objectifying the training process and what's going on. You can't really tell where the athlete is, where they need to go, and how you're going to get there. And that becomes very problematic within this environment. Sometimes the gym can be kind of a black hole. The reason why people people always like to say, well, Charlie Francis and Anatoly Bondarchuk, these guys never needed technology to do a good job. And one of the reasons why I think they could get away without it was that they worked, one, with a small group of people, so they were always interacting. This is very different than a large team. But also, they were really, really good at objectifying the training process. If you read their material, if you read their books, they are very detailed about what they recorded on those athletes, and that allowed them to tell a meaningful story about how the athletes were changing and adapting over time and when changes need to be made in the training program. Additionally, again, provide useful and objective analysis. Of course, this stuff is a bit complex in team sport. Most of the sports science kind of history comes from endurance sports or individual athlete sports, where it's a little bit easier to make sense of things. Obviously, in team sport, you have lots of athletes on the team, so it's a little bit more challenging to individualize training loads and understand what's going on. Frequent competitions in an endurance athlete or one sport athlete, individual sport athlete rather, they might only have to worry about 4 or 5 or maybe 6 competitions that year that they're really, really focused on being ready for. And in team sport, if you lose 3 games, that might be the difference between the playoffs and not the playoffs, and maybe having a job next year. So frequent competitions make things complex. Not everyone competes. We have some guys that play the full game. We have a few guys that are only in certain fixtures, and then we might have guys that don't play at all. Maybe individualization of training load or different microcycles is really important for them. Performance is dependent on the opposition. If I'm training you for the Olympic marathon, I could probably go on Google right now, find out what the course is going to look like, altitude or terrain. I probably have can go on the Weather Channel and get a good idea of what the weather's going to be like and the heat and the humidity in Brazil when the Olympic marathon is run. So then I work backwards from there. I know what how far you have to go. I know what competition day looks like and what the elements that you're going to deal with are. I don't have to really worry about someone at mile number 16 trying to tackle you. Performance in team sport is a little bit harder to quantify when it comes to the training process, because you can have a great training camp or a great week of preparation. Everybody's going in the right direction, everybody feels good, but you still show up to the game and get smashed because the defense threw you a curveball, something you weren't ready for. But despite this complexity, the day-to-day is relatively easy. We go out, the boys do some practice, they run around on the field, they generate some data. That gets fed through a little bit of an analysis, and then we have some feedback and maybe some modifications if necessary. What takes place in that analysis cylinder is really important to me, obviously, because I live in that cylinder, and that's what I do, so it's really important. And when I think about that, a few months ago in the International Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance, one of my PhD supervisors, Aaron Koontz, wrote this cool little editorial called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, the Benefits of Embedding Research Within High Performance. And within that editorial, I think it's probably free on the website if you're interested, and the reference is up at the top. Within that editorial, he talked about sort of two branches or two buckets of sports science. And I think this is a really important way to think about things when it comes down to analyzing data and deriving meaning. On the one hand, the fast sports science is probably what a lot of people are doing right now, particularly within the United States. So it's really easy to collect data, really easy to interpret and provide quick feedback on to the coaches. And this isn't bad. If you're in a team setting, you can't tell the coach that you're going to need 3 years to collect data to say something meaningful because you probably won't have a job the next day. So the fast sports science approach is really, really helpful. But what it ends up being is what I call a subjective interpretation of objective data. And what I mean by that is people take in some information, they buy some technology, they start tracking their players, and they apply the coaching heuristics that they've developed over the years to that data in order to make statements about the athlete. And of course, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to say, this guy typically runs 400 meters of high-speed running in practice, and today he did 800 meters. We probably need to do something different tomorrow in order to maybe mitigate injury or think about how he's prepared going into the game. Again, this isn't bad, but what I think is more important is that we need the slow sports science to help us really refine our questions and get to the deeper level questions that we might be trying to ask. I can't tell you how many times I've talked with friends, colleagues, people at other teams. They tell me, I'd really like to answer these questions. And they're sitting on 2, 3, sometimes 4 years worth of data. And I'm thinking, geez, you could probably answer those questions if you sat down with that data and tried to make sense of it. Of course, there's problems there. Sometimes skill set is an issue, like how do we look at all this data? It's overwhelming. And then the other thing is trying to really make sense of that. They might not have contextualized the data over the previous 4 years in the appropriate way and coded it so that they can go back and answer some of those questions that now, later on, 4 years later, they're thinking about asking. But within that slow sports science, this is really about long-term collection, developing models. And these models are really important because what they do is they take the coaching heuristics that you've built. They take your prior experience, which I think is really important and I'll talk about previously. They're not removing your ability to do the art of strength and conditioning, but what they're doing is helping refine those heuristics and putting guardrails on them so that we can say something really meaningful about the players to the coach and be very, very targeted and refined within that approach. So that's a little bit about the framework. I'll tell you a little bit about some data collection methods, show you some examples of charts and graphs and what it means. There's various streams of data that we collect, that we can collect. This is by no means an exhaustive list, clearly. These are just a few things I threw up there. And I like things to be in buckets if you haven't already kind of seen that, because it helps me organize my head. So within data collection around team sport, I think there's two things that we really are looking at. We're looking at data that can tell us about training, and we're looking at data that can tell us about wellness or fatigue over time or adaptation. Training data, integrated microtechnologies, so GPS and the like, heart rate, which could probably play into that as well. RPE, which is super inexpensive and will cost you nothing, but can be valuable if you do it the right way. Power outputs and training loads, total volume, total tonnage. These things are very, very simple to collect, literally piece of paper and a pencil, and gather information on your data. Bar velocities, have become very popular. We saw Dan Baker give a good presentation this week. Brian Mann's written some really good applied articles for practitioners as well, stuff that you could maybe check out if that's the way that you want to go about objectifying what you do in the weight room. On the fatigue side of things, the wellness side of things, wellness questionnaires are super simple, again, if you just do them the right way. Sleep, everybody knows that's important. There's easy ways to track that now that might give you some information. Nutrition probably isn't about monitoring as much as it's just the importance of it over time. Heart rate variability is a popular thing for a lot of people. I think sometimes, again, with that standardization of data collection process, it can be a little bit challenging within the team environment to make sure you're getting clean data. Blood, saliva collections, those are things that people have looked at over the years as well. this always leads to the question of what should we collect? Well, the first thing I would say is what makes sense in your environment. If you've never collected anything and you show up on Monday and you're like, here we go, we're going to collect these 5 things, I can tell you without a doubt the players will revolt. And the coaches will probably hate you because within a few days you're going to be trying to report to them all this garbage that they don't even know how to make sense of. So start really slow. Start with some basic things. Start with things that make sense in your environment, low-hanging fruit, simple methods. Cost is a problem if you're at a university where you don't have funding, or you're at a high school where you don't have funding. That could be difficult. Time, ease of collection and analysis. So if it takes really long to analyze the data, if it takes really long or it's not easy to collect it, that's going to be a problem. Usability of the data. Are we just collecting stuff that in our minds we think is important? Or, and I'll take a step back from there and say that there are things that we do that's kind of exploratory, where we might be looking at some data and trying to make sense of what it might mean. But I always try and have in my head the end goal. What is the usability? How can people use this information? I don't want to just collect numbers and put them on a page and talk about what they mean without having to follow through and operationalization of the data. The other way of just collecting stuff is no more useful than me building you a random number generator in Excel, and you can hit the space bar every day and get some information that you report to the coach, but it means nothing. But if you're interested in that, you can email me and I will build that for a small fee. Signal to noise. Is the technology you're using very, very noisy, or can you detect a signal? If you can't detect a signal, if you're taking something that's really noisy, just stop wasting your time. I go to lots of analytics conferences, sports science conferences, and I see friends and colleagues, and they report their dashboards up on the screen. They got these amazing Excel pivot tables with gauges and bars and numbers and all this stuff about the athlete, and people in the audience are blowing it up and taking pictures and all that kind of stuff. And the whole time I'm thinking, like, well, why are you taking a picture of this? Like, I can't even understand the context of it, one. And two, how do you even make sense of this? If you're recording 20 things and we're using just a simple red, yellow, green traffic light type of indicator, if you're recording 20 things and 18 of them are in the green and 2 of them in the red, how do you make sense of those 2 things in the red? Do you tell the coach that the player needs to be held out? Chances are when you really press someone on that, they step back and they say, yeah, well, we only really look at these 3 things. Well, then eliminate the other 17. I would rather have a few things that I can go really, really deep on, gather a lot of information on, and really understand the context of those things for our athletes so that I'm really certain about what it is we're presenting to the coaches. So never feel bad about removing things. I throw things out all the time. If we think it's important, if it's really noisy, the next step is, okay, if you think it's important, it's really noisy, let's figure out how to get a better process around collecting it so that we can make sense of it a little bit better. Otherwise, let's just remove it and not waste our time, not waste the athlete's time, etc. So that being said, what are the things that we collect or that we find to be important for us? On the training side of things, we look at integrated microtechnology. Oh, some sort of thing came up about in the middle of the screen there. I don't know. At least on my screen. Maybe not on yours. Go ahead. It's touch screen. It's touch screen. No, it's not. It's not. Oh. That's on tape. Okay, here we go. Cool. Things that we collect in our setting that we try and make sense of: integrated microtechnologies, RPEs help tell us about training, wellness questionnaires help tell us about the athlete over time, and then sleep. Obviously, we'll do a little bit of sleep tracking, particularly if you're trying to find out if guys have apnea and things like that. And then nutrition is obviously very important. So let's look at some examples. Quantifying training load, RPE, is if you're somewhere where you don't have any technology, this is probably the easiest thing you can do. Use the Borg CR10 scale. Anchor the athletes to the verbiage first. When I was with Canada basketball doing sports science stuff for the men's national team, the way that we would do this, we would just run the kids through the yo-yo intermittent recovery test. They'd go to the max. So once they had their two failures and they were out, we would get them to look at the RPE scale, we'd get them to understand the verbiage and get them to score that so that in subsequent practices, they were able to reflect on those practices relative to what they had felt when they ran a maximal effort test. So anchor the athletes to the verbiage. I'm going to show you what the Borg scale looks like in a little bit. Record the session RPE following training, obviously. 15 to 30 minutes is the typical kind of way that this has been reported in the literature, reason being if you record it immediately after the training session, you get what's called a terminal RPE, where the athlete tends to reflect on the last thing that they did. So if the last thing you did in your training session was some hard sprint intervals, the athlete might report that the session was really, really hard. But what we want to do is we want to get the athlete to reflect on the session in its entirety. So waiting 15 to 30 minutes has been the traditional way of doing this. Of course, maybe we don't need to wait that long. Certainly if you're in an environment where time is a problem, like we talked about within the culture side of things, so maybe a high school, college setting where the kids have to take a shower really quick and get to class, you might not be able to keep them there for 15 to 30 minutes. And some researchers have looked at this. That's on the bottom there is one of Aaron Kutz's studies looking at this. So maybe we don't need to wait that long, maybe as little as 10 minutes after the session. Once the players have had a chance to kind of catch their breath, we can get some meaningful information. Coach's RPE versus player's RPE is a great way to engage your coach, get them educated on what's going on with the players. A lot of times what I find is coaches have kind of this preset idea of what the session is. So they say this session is always a 6. But they don't really understand that they're not the ones going through it, and the players are bringing to it a lot of maybe cumulative fatigue over time, residual fatigue, maybe they came out of a hard game, etc. So for the players, that 6 that the coach feels the session is might be an 8 or a 9. So educating the coach along the way is really important. This has been looked at by Brink and colleagues. I think they were under 17 and under 19 elite soccer players, and they found just that. The players were all thinking that training was more intense than the coach had originally intended. So it's super simple. There's the CR10 scale. There's numbers, there's verbiage. We put colors on ours, trying to appeal to different learning styles. Really easy to use if you don't have any technology to capture this. Pen and a piece of paper. Google Docs is free. You can get it deposited into an Excel sheet, so you just email it out. So even if time is an issue, as the kids are running out, you just let them know that at some point in the next 30 minutes or so, you're going to send them an email. And you can bulk email that, and it'll come to their phone, they answer it, and it just comes back to you and gets deposited into your Google Excel doc. So it's super simple to get your training load from this. All you do is you take the individual session RPE, you multiply it by the training and duration, and you get your training load in arbitrary units. The one thing I would say is try and get the athletes to individually rate this. What you want to avoid is groupthink. So if you get a bunch of guys together and they're all scoring it at the same time and they can see what the other's scoring, you get really difficult data, because someone who thought that the session was really hard but sees that the 2 guys next to him thought it was easy might be a little bit embarrassed to tell the coach that he thought it was hard, so he might score differently. So we try and get them to individually do this as best as possible. Once you get the training load, you can start to look at some different data. So weekly training load microcycles, so game day -4, -3, and -2. Give you an idea of what the microcycle looks like between certain fixtures of games, so depending on certain time periods between games. Maybe start to ask questions about the context around this. Is this good or bad, or maybe is there a different way of doing things, or if you have a shorter period of time or longer period of time between games, maybe what does it look like? Of course, you can then take it to another level and start to look at maybe individual position groups. You see some of the position groups share a similar trend of weekly microcycle to what the team was. Obviously, other groups don't. Running backs, it's a little more flat between game day -4 and -3. So maybe for them, we're then asking questions, geez, why is that? Why could that be? Is there anything we can do about it? Additionally, keeping in mind that, players who might not participate in the games are putting data into this data set. Maybe there's other levels of context that we need to take it in order to say something meaningful about the players who are going to actually compete. Integrated microtechnologies is basically just a simple little, I don't know if that's really simple, but it's a little unit that the players wear between their shoulder blades. Gives us 4 kind of key pieces of information there. GPS tells us a little bit about position. So that's how we get distances traveled, accelerations, decelerations, etc. Gyroscope tells us about rotations, magnetometer about directions, and accelerometer tells us a little bit about the forces on the 3 axes, so X, Y, and Z, or anterior, posterior, medial, lateral, up and down. So over the past 10, 15 years, this has been looked at, and it's been found to be valid and reliable as a tracking technology for team sport athletes, so for humans. There are areas where the reliability maybe is not as high as we would like, but for the most part, it's a reasonable proxy of what the person did in training, so it's a good starting point. Also, the reliability of the accelerometers has been looked at for collision sport athletes. This paper was Australian football, but of course this has been used in rugby, rugby union, rugby league, and American football as well. This data can help us talk a little bit about training, as well as if you can wear it in games. We're not allowed to wear it in games. Some sports are. NCAA allows their players to wear it in games. And so these guys, Wellman and colleagues, did a cool little paper kind of looking at, they did two papers rather, one locomotor demands, which is this, and another paper that just came out in JSCR that's about collisions and impacts across 12 games in one season for one single team. And this just reports some normative data and maybe allows us to understand what our training targets should be. Is training meeting or exceeding game demands? We know what we should be preparing the athletes for. We now have an idea of maybe what off-season conditioning should look like. Additionally, it allows us to understand differences between position groups, keeping in mind that this is, of course, just one single team. So style of play, and even this is an NCAA team, so level of play might be drastically different from other things with your team. But gives us an idea across position groups. Of course, there's always people that are going to make silly comments like, well, we don't need GPS to tell us that wide receivers go out and run more than offensive linemen. And yet, this is 100% true. Certainly, anybody who watches the game understands that offensive linemen do not run as much as wide receivers. However, remembering the first quote, that's the theme of this, we want objective data so that we can explain these things because we want to know how much more the wide receivers run than the offensive linemen. What's the difference? What's the magnitude of that difference? And also, importantly, what's normal for these position groups so that we can start to identify what's not normal. Again, maybe in team sport, what happens in the game is dependent on the defense. So maybe some of this gets skewed at times during the season by what the defense did to you and how they played you and the tactics that they used. Identifying what's not normal or when the player is outside of normal allows you to be more targeted with what you do for them in the subsequent weeks in order to get them back on track. Additionally, we look at this over to the long term. And this graph here is looking at a player load over an entire season for one individual. A lot of times when people do this stuff or do any kind of monitoring, what they do is they build baselines and they build their thresholds of important changes on preseason data or on a 3-week baseline period or something like that. And they utilize that for the entire season. And for me, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense because people change, they adapt, they get better, they get worse, etc. And we want to be able to identify points where change takes place. So the vertical line, the vertical dashed line on the top graph is basically showing us that at that moment, a change took place in the training for this individual athlete. And there's some mathematical gymnastics that go on for this and some algorithm writing that go on under the hood to tell us where this happens and why this happens. But if you look at the graph on the bottom, you can see the averages for each of those respective batches of data. And I didn't put thresholds on there, but you could just notice that a change took place in this athlete. His training load increased after a certain period of time and stayed increased for the entire season. We didn't have any other change. And if we kept that first horizontal bar, that first average training bar for the entire season, essentially we would be reporting to the coach that every single session that athlete did the rest of the season was he was overtraining, he was at risk. And the coach is going to throw something at you and go crazy because this player adapted well, the change was okay for him, and we had other data to suggest that he was okay and good to go. So all we do is we make a change to our thresholds there, and then we keep going on, and then obviously we also have some day-to-day analysis that tells us a little bit about when certain days are outside of what we would expect to be normal and that as well. Simple methods of quantifying fatigue. So literally this is as easy as asking the individual, how do you feel today? And then just response. There's lots of different options for this. If this is a topic you're interested in, I'd highly recommend Enhancing Recovery book by Michael Kellman or any of his research on these kinds of questionnaires. The book is really good, kind of goes over in depth on how to utilize these things and what they mean in a practical sense and how to action on them. Additionally, there's an Australian girl doing her PhD, Anna Saw, and her whole PhD is on things like this, questionnaires and stuff. So she's written some really cool kind of articles that are beneficial and helpful. So I would look at those two individuals if you were trying to find out more information on this. Of course, it can be really, really simple. This is a paper from McLean and Coots, and Mike McQuiggan. Hopefully I said that last name right if he's in here. I apologize if it's not right. But super simple questionnaire that they utilized to look at the time course of recovery for rugby players across different fixtures of games. So 4 games between a game, 6 days between a game, 8 days between a game, etc. Time course for recovery. And they looked at a whole bunch of factors, but the questionnaire that they use is one that I like because it's really simple. 5 questions, 5 responses. The athlete scores what they have, and then you can total it or you can average it. Different people do different things. We total ours, and we just give a simple report. Obviously, there's some thresholds in there specific to these individuals. We can look at the total wellness, and we can look at the individual scores that might be contributing to that total wellness, and then make decisions on that athlete as well. We look at this data over time, and I don't know, yeah, you can see the gray. So the gray in the background is that data, is that individual's data for every single day that season. And so you can see there's some considerable variability. It might be low and then high and then low. And obviously this is because sometimes the questionnaire is done immediately after a game, or sorry, the day after a game. It might be done after a day of recovery. It might be done after 2 days of hard practices, etc. So we use a little bit of math. We kind of smooth out that day-to-day variability. We have our thresholds there, and that allows us to just identify areas where the athlete might be responding abnormally. Anything we can do to help get them on track or have discussions about why that might be happening can be really helpful. All right, so a little bit on the data analysis piece, which is probably my favorite piece. So some initial procedures. When I sit down with a data set, some things I think about. One, how clean is the data you're about to analyze? Is it really sloppy and messy? Maybe you don't waste your time. I always try and say the more clean that you can get, the better. Produce graphics and visualizations. This is a good way to start. Graphs and visualizations allow me to ask questions that I might not have originally had. So when I sit down with the data sets, maybe large data sets on lots of different topics, or merged data sets across lots of different topics, the graphs and visualizations give me the opportunity to, maybe I go in with an initial question, but give me an opportunity to ask other questions once I see kind of how the data lies. Summary statistics are a good start. They give you a compass for your analysis, so measure the central tendency and variance, etc. Of course, in the applied setting, things can become a little bit challenging here. So looking at distributions of the data is really important. You might have to use different kinds of statistical procedures that can handle data that's not normally distributed. If you transform the data, you might have to figure out what that exactly means on the normal scale, or you might have to use other statistical procedures or machine learning procedures that can kind of explain some of this stuff. Of course, we always have outliers. Are those outliers an error in recording the data? So maybe you look back and see if there's something that needs to be cleaned up. GPS, we've seen it where the GPS loses lock, and then all of a sudden it says that your 310-pound lineman had a max velocity of 42 miles per hour. This is clearly impossible. So make some changes there and address things within the data, clean it up. Also, maybe outliers are the best. Sometimes when we're in elite sport, we're working with the top-notch guys. And so there's statistical procedures that we might need to utilize that help us analyze or make sense of those outliers or those artifacts that we see within the data that might be of interest. And then missing values are always a problem. In the applied setting, we're dealing with players over time who forget things. He does his questionnaire 2 days in a row, then he forgets for 3 days, then he does it one more day, then he forgets again, and he wears his GPS one day, he forgets 2 days, etc. So you start to ask yourself, geez, what am I going to do with all of these missing values? Is there too many missing values where I have to remove players from an analysis? Or can I impute values? If I'm going to impute values, there's multiple different methods of imputation. What method am I going to use? What makes sense with this data set? Will it allow me to get better or get closer to answering the question that I want to answer? And then context is everything. So how you contextualize the data is essential. This is a good quote from Ben Alamar, who's the Statistical Analytics Director at ESPN, I believe is his title. Raw data are rarely useful because data are just an input with no analysis or context. So after those initial procedures, I always ask myself, what are you trying to do? And this is, again, by no means an exhaustive list, but when I think about this stuff, I usually think, again, buckets. These 3 buckets, these are the kind of things that I'm trying to do. I'm either trying to describe something, I'm trying to predict something, or I'm trying to classify something. So maybe description, I'm trying to describe validity, reliability of a test or a technology so that we can make decisions about the data or the cost-benefit analysis. Maybe I'm trying to describe a practice or game demands for players or position groups or a team. Maybe I'm trying to create some player profiles from those demands or player profiles based on test batteries. Or maybe I'm trying to understand inter-individual differences and describe those, which is really, really important within the context that we work, is understanding inter-individual differences so that we can make better decisions about the individuals that we see. Maybe I'm trying to predict something, so maybe performance outcomes I'm trying to predict, or but the potential for team success or ability, or an individual success or ability. So if we're trying to do some talent identification type of stuff. Or maybe I'm trying to classify something. So maybe classifying players based on training or physical profiles, or maybe classifying players based on some sort of injury risk or probability. The steps that I go through to do this, always start with a good question. Don't sit down with a data set and just hope to find something, because if you torture the data long enough, you're going to find something, and it might not mean that that something is meaningful, and it might not mean that that something is anything other than coincidence. Determine the necessary data streams that you need to answer that question. In some cases, it might be data that you're already collecting. In other cases, it might be data that you need to start collecting to answer that question. And sometimes it might be data that you can get from other places, so scraping data, ripping data from different places, cleaning it up, pre-processing it, merging it into your data set based on certain factors. Those might be useful things to do if you're trying to answer certain questions. Determine the analysis that will answer your question. This is a really important one to me, and it's because a lot of times people apply statistical procedures for a question that they have, but the statistical procedure isn't really valuable for answering that specific question. It's like sometimes I read a paper, and the whole time I'm thinking, you're trying to tell me the story of Snow White, but your statistics are telling me about Cinderella. It doesn't add up. And sometimes we're limited. So if all you're good with is means and standard deviations and correlation, because it's really easy to do those things in Excel, you might be limited to what kind of questions you can answer. And you might start with a good question, and you're going to try and answer that question with those simple methods. Not that there's anything wrong with those methods, but they can't answer everything. You're going to try and answer that question, and you're going to come to very spurious conclusions, which can be terribly damaging in elite sport, where we're making decisions about players' health in this context. Additionally, in exercise science, most of the statistics rarely go beyond simple things like two-way ANOVA, multiple regression, and logistic regression. Nothing wrong with these procedures. They're very good. I use them. But they can only answer certain questions. And sometimes people want to answer bigger questions, and those models fail, or they fail to infer forward because maybe they're just describing an event that took place, but they can't really tell us anything about or future-proof that data set. So we might have to step outside of our comfort area, learn some different mathematical approaches to answer some of these questions. So thinking about what to apply to that question is really important. Once you're done with the analysis, obviously contextualize that data with regard to whichever of those decision makers you need to speak to, the things that are important to them. And then have discussions about turning the data into action. So this is a great quote. It's from a statistician in the UK. All decisions should be based on evidence, but the best decisions should be based on previous experience. So again, a lot of times coaches, strength coaches, etc., they get this sense that more data is going to remove the art of strength and conditioning or the art of coaching. And I don't think that's true. I think that there's times, I think that there's always times we need both of them. There's going to be times where the gut feel, the art of it is the rear view mirror, and the data analysis is your side view mirror, making sure to check the blind spots so that you're really certain about what you're seeing. And there will be other times where that's flip-flopped, where the analysis is going to tell us something very, very specific and meaningful, and the art of things and how the person's opinion or the intuition of the coach, how they see things, might be checking the blind spots, because not all analysis can tell us about everything. There's certainly limitations in all models. And so this is a great quote. He said this with regard to Bayesian data analysis, which I'm not going to go too much into, but the basic idea is that you have this subjective perception of something that might take place, either based on some data that you had or based on your subjective idea of what might take place. You have some observed data, and you do some fun little math to combine those in order to give you a probability of what might take place in the future. So previous experience, gut feel, don't throw them out the window. This is just a new way to help us check our blind spots and provide us with more information. And then obviously continually iterate the model in the applied setting. These models are not stagnant. These models can get stagnant very fast, rather. So if something changes, players change, coaches change, et cetera, the context of that data, the context of that model might not always apply. So just to sum up, collect data that's meaningful. Oops. Take a fast and slow approach to sports science. Be objective. This is a great quote from Michael Lewis's Moneyball book. They're just about trying to remove some of our objective perceptions of things and having data to help us out. Set up analysis approaches that are important, that answer important questions, and then continually develop and iterate the model. All models have limitations and uncertainties. Whenever I go and present a model, I'm always upfront about what the uncertainty is within that model and what the limitations are. Because like I said, the models can't tell you about everything. Sometimes we need, not sometimes, all of the time, we need the coaches to fill in the blanks of things that we don't otherwise know. So that's what I got.